Okay, everybody ready to start a great program? Yo, yo. Yo. Does this sound like it's on? Hang on a minute. How many minutes? Okay. If everybody will grab a seat, please. So welcome to the Bexley Public Library. Let's turn that off. So, yeah, thank you. And I'll try to speak up as well. My name's Sam Szymanski. I'm a trustee here and have been for decades, unfortunately. And looking around this room, a lot of familiar faces, of course, but as I was upstairs with the Razek Art Show, in walks Bruce Aldrich, whom I've only known since 1966, I hate to say. And he says, hey, I'm going down to the basketball gig, and guess who's there? Gene Millard. Now, for those of you who don't know, Gene is reputed, and I don't know if it's true or not, to have scored the first points in where? Right. And so, as a student at Bexley High School, the Millards were not only great people and great coaches, but what they did was they set the standard for being a great human being. And how did they do that? By not only caring for the entire student body and making everybody, and I mean everybody, feel welcome and valued and frankly loved, but they were the kind of people that went out of their way to also open their home to kids who were less fortunate, who didn't have Gene and Sally Millard as parents. And it was an inspiration, I kid you not, to all of us. It wasn't about just Gene's great prowess on the basketball court, his great success as a coach. And I'm sure most of you remember, I was in law school at the time. It was the greatest basketball game I ever saw, that semifinal against that team from Akron, when yeah, thank you. When we had that incredible come from behind victory and then went all the way to the States. But the bottom line is, what you have here is a man who epitomizes what this community is all about. And you don't need to hear me run my mouth anymore, but let's give a really heartfelt thank you to the Millards. All right, and now we're ready to rock.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. I always know that when the library is going to work with Lee Caryer, it's going to be a very special event. So thank you again to Lee for organizing all of this. We're looking forward to your stories. I just want to let everyone know that this is being recorded, so you can tell your friends about it later. There will be a recording on the Bexley Public Library YouTube page. And now I'll just welcome Lee. Yay.
Well, I hadn't planned to start with stories about Gene Millard, but I can't help myself now with that. So I will correct Mr. Szymanski and say that, what was I going to say? See, that we're going to have a lot of this today. Gene Millard is not just the man who made the last basket in St. John Arena. The truth is, because... This better? All right, thank you. We'll keep it up there. The truth is, he did make the first basket in St. John Arena in a live game. He did make the last basket in St. John Arena with a layup, because that's what they asked him to do. But then something only Gene Millard would do, he got the ball back, he took it to the three-point line and sunk the last basket from the three-point line. Gene and I first met in the fall of 1962 when he was a new teacher at Bexley and the Bexley coach. And Gene wanted us to learn about civil rights and World War II, and all I wanted to learn was how Larry Siegfried was doing in the Pro-Am League that Gene was playing in. So that's our start. Back then, I had to wear glasses. I get cataracts removed, and I still have to wear glasses. That's the story. Okay. Jerry Lucas is not here today. I'm very sorry about that. I want to describe what happened. He had a problem with the defibrillator in his heart and was in quite a bit of pain. We were very concerned about that. That problem was solved, and he thought he could be here with us. Unfortunately, the medications that were used to solve that problem caused him to have some anxiety. They caused him to not be able to get to sleep. He's feeling poorly, but he's doing well. I guess that's the best way to put it. And he sends his best regards, and he said, tell everybody I love them and hello. Now, what I want to do about that is to react, because I was really disappointed, and I knew you would all be disappointed too. And our show's not going to be as good today as it would have been with him. That's for sure. You can't get around that. But what we can do is give back to him. And my first thought is for each of you who's so inclined to send a note to me, to my email address, addressed to Jerry. Some kind of thank you or good wishes or take good care of yourself or we miss you or whatever it happens to be. Send it to my email, and I'll give you that in just a minute if you have a piece of paper. It's written back there as well. The other thing is to tell you a story about Jerry and what kind of a person he is. I had a problem with my heart about 4 years ago. It was called sudden cardiac arrest or sudden cardiac death, because 19 out of 20 of people who had it died. You had to get medical attention within 60 minutes. I was fortunate that the people around me knew what they were doing, that the 911 call worked, that the hospital was ready, and I was taken care of in 31 minutes. And what was very frightening to my relatives and friends who knew about it even was really not that big a deal overall. They caught it in time. They told me, you're excused from the hospital in record time and expect to get back to normal in a little bit of time. And I did. So when people would call and ask how I was doing, I always said, I'm doing fine, except for Jerry. And my friends would stop calling me except for Jerry, because I was doing fine. So finally I said, Jerry, I told you before, I'm really doing fine, and you don't need to bother to call me. You're a busy guy, you got a lot of things going on. And he said, well, if you don't want me to call, I won't call, but you can't stop me from praying for you. So that's about the way I felt and still feel. So I would like to take a moment of silence right now so that I can pray for Jerry's health, and I hope you'll join me and that you'll think of him until we hear that everything's fine. Thank you. So now we're going to get started celebrating one of the greatest teams in college basketball history and easily the greatest team in Ohio State history. Then we're going to meet the men who caused that to happen and talk about them and the people who couldn't be with us today. Then we're going to talk about a team that really deserves a lot more recognition than it's gotten over the years because of the similarities and the differences that they had with the 60 team. Then we're going to have a Q&A session. So that's the agenda. And when I wrote this book, The Golden Age of Ohio State Basketball, I got to talk to all of Fred's players and all of Fred's coaches and Fred. And it was just a great experience. It was just a treat. I've never had work be so much fun in my life as that was. All of them talked about Fred and what he meant to that team. And frankly, the other players on the other teams talked about him in the same way. Some of them saw him as the father that they didn't have. And some of them saw him as the father that they loved and adored, a second father. That's the way the players felt about him. Some facts. He's the only Ohio State coach in the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame solely as a coach. Twice National Coach of the Year. President of the National Association of Basketball Coaches. Member of the United States Olympic Basketball Committee from 1964 to 1972. His coaching record was 297 and 158. In NCAA play against the best teams in the country, it was 14-4. As much as any coach ever, he put players first. When he recruited you, He said, what I have to offer is you'll get a college education and we will compete for the Big Ten championship. That was it. He didn't think there was anything else that mattered. He attracted the kind of kids who bought what he was selling because it was what he believed. Some of his traits. When a player, first team or third team, was having trouble with his academics, Fred would say this: your grades aren't where they need to be. You can work harder and stay on the team, or you can leave the team, work harder with that extra time, and come back to the team in good graces. That's truly putting education above competing in sports. There was a player who skipped some pickup games in the spring. That's when the kids practiced, and the coaches wanted them to practice and get better, but the coaches couldn't be involved. But Fred hears everything, or heard it. So he knew about it. He called him in. And the player was a good player, and the player said, my grades aren't where they ought to be. You said that education was first. My grades will be where they need to be by the end of this quarter. That was the end of the discussion. That's the way it worked. That player turned out to be a captain of a future team. It was never mentioned in the media, but Fred took players to Children's Hospital so the sick kids could meet their heroes and the players could meet the other side of life that these are great athletes in great condition, and they could see what it was like to be sick. Fred didn't tell me that. I heard that from one of the players on the 71 team who told me that he and his girlfriend used to go to the hospital other than the trips with the team, just because they thought it was the thing to do. That man became a hospital administrator. I contacted Children's, told them that story, and offered them copies of this book signed by Fred, Bill Hoskett, Mel Nowell, Jerry Lucas, Dick Ricketts, Tom Bowman, whole bunch of players. And they gave the books away to people who made significant contributions. We raised $20,000 that way. Fred liked that. When the NBA 50 greatest players were announced, John Havlicek and Jerry Lucas were on the list. I noticed two other players on the list that Ohio State started to recruit, but he found out that they couldn't do college work. He stopped recruiting them. He had an unusual idea about recruiting. He didn't take two players from the same team. He said he thought they would be better off if they weren't competing with each other again. I checked him on that. I found 5 instances when he failed to recruit a player on a team because he was recruiting another player. He was really looking out for what he thought were the best interests of the players. He recruited Jim Clemens, but not his teammate who was more famous at the time. His teammate wanted to be recruited by Ohio State. Fred didn't recruit him. This teammate bore ill will for decades, talking about it being a racist situation. Jim Clemens was an NBA coach, came back from who knows where for Fred Taylor's funeral. I asked him once, how did that happen? He said, I don't remember. He said, it does sound like it was a difficult thing to do, but I knew I had to be there. That's the opposite of racism. There was a freshman from Zanesville, Rosecrans, who walked on to the Ohio State team in 1974. His name was John Kozak. I met him at a function for the basketball team. He played hard, but he was only 5'9". This guy was 5'9" too, and he played harder. But Kozak was just too small. That was the problem. He was an accountant, and that's what he wanted to be. And he was a very successful accounting student. He was an honor student. So the accounting firms are interested in him, and his advisors told him, you really ought to get a couple of different options, job offers to compare. So he had one he liked, and because they suggested that he go get another offer, he did. And the guy that he met with, and this was now about 76, the guy that he met with didn't like Fred Taylor or didn't like what he heard about Fred Taylor. Kozak didn't want to hear that. Kozak had really developed an affection for Fred Taylor like the vast majority of his players did. Kozak defended Taylor. The guy continued. Kozak said, I've heard enough. Fred Taylor, I know Fred Taylor, and I love Fred Taylor. This interview is over. So the next day, he got called into the dean's office. The dean says, I heard about your interview. Kozak said, I didn't want to have any problems for Ohio State. He said, no. He said, that's not the issue. There's no way that's a problem. I know Fred Taylor, and I love Fred Taylor. But John, if you have a minute, I'd like to make a phone call for you. So they called the general partner of that second accounting firm. And the guy who was the general partner talked to Kozak over the three-way intercom that they had set up at the time. I don't really know how it worked back in the 70s. Heck, I don't know how it works now. But the three of them had the conversation, and the second manager made an offer. He said, I've read your resume, very interested in having you here at the firm, like to make you an offer. Kozak said, I accepted the first offer when I got home yesterday. And the man said, I understand. I know Fred Taylor, and I love Fred Taylor too. When I had the opportunity to ask John Wooden what he thought of Fred Taylor, and that was quite a thrill because he had retired, but I mean, he was a legend in my mind. I probably read every book he ever wrote. So I asked John Wooden to evaluate Fred Taylor as a basketball coach. He said no. Well, that sort of stopped me because I thought I had the one safe answer to get started with. But Wooden didn't leave me hanging. He said, who someone is more important than what someone does. Then he talked about Fred as a basketball coach. One of the highlights of my week for several weeks was the day I would go talk to Fred at their house in Arlington. And this particular day, I remember because Fred was working on the door of the front door, the screen. And so I get out of my car and I look up and I see him and he doesn't see me yet. So to get his attention, I said, hello, Mr. Fix-It. He looks up, he says, I'm about as handy as a bear cub wearing boxing gloves. Now, once you have that image in your mind, you can't get rid of it. And that's the way Fred talked. He used the same words as the rest of us. He just used them better than the rest of us. He had so many phrases that he used over and over in practice that his players called them Fredisms. I have a whole page of Fredisms in my book because the players referred them to them so often. My favorite one is he'd run a play. When he wasn't satisfied with the play, he'd say, did you ever think there might be a reason we ask you to set a screen? Now, how are you going to answer that question? You set better screens is the only answer I know. Assistant coach Jack Graff seemed to have two lives at the same time. At Ohio State, he lettered for 3 years in football and 3 years in basketball. When he was MVP of the Big Ten in football, he was the captain of the basketball team. When the NFL drafted him, he chose to go to Harvard to get an MBA while coaching an Army team. According to Paul Brown's book, Paul Brown was the coach at Ohio State at that time, Graff was class president and also acted on Broadway. So this guy is what you call a multitasker. When he returned to Columbus to work for his father at Graff & Sons engineering firm, athletic director Dick Larkins told him Ohio State needed coaches. Graff worked as an assistant coach on the football side for several years, and he was an assistant basketball coach for 26 years. When Ohio State went to the Rose Bowl after the '54 season, so this was January of '55, they took Floyd Stahl off his job as head basketball coach and put him in charge of travel arrangements for the football team. So Graff and Taylor, who by then was the freshman basketball coach, ran the team until Floyd Stahl could get back from the Rose Bowl. When Taylor was hired as a coach, he wanted Graff to continue because he knew what kind of man he was getting, even if it was only on a part-time basis. Fred said he had a great insight to the sport and a certain insight to evaluate a person. He often said, remember, we're critical of the act, not the individual. When Frank Truitt led Columbus North to an undefeated season, including an upset of mighty Middletown, before losing in the state title game. He signed to coach Otterbein in the coming season. The contract had an interesting clause. If the job as Ohio State freshman coach was offered, he could accept it. It was offered. He did accept it. So in his first year at Ohio State, at the age of 33, Frank was responsible for turning one of the best recruiting classes in basketball history into college players. Since those guys went 78-6, winning 3 Big Ten titles, never losing a game until the title was assured, he more than rose to the challenge. 2 more years at Ohio State, 2 more championships. Louisiana State came calling. He became head coach there in 1965. After a disappointing season, Truitt had a plan to rebuild the program. When the athletic director saw his recruiting list, he said, "We can't recruit these players. We're not ready for this." He was talking about the racism that was in the Big Ten at that time. However, Taylor had transcended that, because when he was hired, he made it clear he was going to recruit players who could do college work and play basketball. If they couldn't do college work, they wouldn't play, white or black. That was not an issue. So Truitt wasn't ready for that kind of a decision by a school he'd gone to coach with. He left immediately. Almost as quickly, he became head coach at Kent State. Fred said, "Frank gave the kids his time, the most precious gift one person can give another. He really cared about the players, and they knew that." Bill Hoskett, All-American, Olympic gold medalist, and NBA player, said Frank was the best teacher of individual skills I've ever been around. Bob Knight said, "Truitt was better at scouting than anyone I've ever seen in college." At Larry Siegfried's funeral in 2010, every single OSU player who was there, and a lot of them were, walked back to the end of the pews to where Frank was seated in a wheelchair to say hello to him and to say thanks to him. Today we've got 2 players from the 1960 team with us, 2 players who would have been with us if they could. To Jerry and Mel Nowell, I say, "Hi guys, we're thinking of you." Which reminds me to tell you that this program is going to be available on both YouTube and the Bexley Public Library YouTube channel. So you can tell your friends about it if you enjoy it. There was one essential factor in the success of the 60 team, which was unselfishness. Several of the players sacrificed greatly in order for the team to achieve what they did. Dick Furry had 3 things in mind when he was selecting a college. He wanted an accounting degree, he wanted a spot on the basketball team, and he wanted to try out for the track team. So he had won the high jump in the state the year before. He accomplished all 3 and more. Playing time was scarce as a sophomore forward, competing with Joe Roberts and 3 guys who'd been starting the year before. When Frank Howard and Ken Seidel graduated, they became starting forwards on Fred's first team. Dick started 20 of 22 games. 2 were particularly outstanding. At NCAA defending champion Kentucky, Dick had 25 points and 23 rebounds. Against Wisconsin in St. John Arena, he had 20 points and 23 rebounds. Today, people get excited when a player gets a double-double. They don't talk about guys who get 20-20s because nobody does it. In Ohio State history, only 4 people have gotten 20 rebounds in a game. Furry, Lucas, Hoskett, Frank Howard. Those are the 4. For the season, Dick averaged 11 points and 10.7 rebounds. 11 points is solid. The rebounding really stands out. Try to guess how many Buckeyes in the 2000s have gotten 10.7 rebounds a game. Sullinger? Nope. Kufas? Nope. Oden? Nope. Anybody else? No. Not in the 2000s. In fact, you have to go back to 1986 to find a Buckeye who got more than 10.7 rebounds. So what you have to say is that he was an established player. Next season, Furry and Roberts were co-captains with the support of seniors David Barker, John Cedergren, and Howie Nurse. They provided valuable leadership and support for the younger players. Roberts started every game on the first team to win a national championship and send every starting player to the NBA. Furry played in every game, but only started one. Sophomore John Havlicek took his starting position. Looking back, knowing that John was in 13 All-Star games and put dozens of great NBA players on the bench, this doesn't sound like much of a problem. At the time, Furry was an established senior beaten out by a sophomore. He responded by being the type of team player which saw him become president of 2 corporations before retiring. He led, mentored, and played hard when he had the opportunity. After graduation, he stayed in contact with the other players on the 60 team to keep teammates together. When Havlicek died in 2019, Roberts and Furry knew they were going to attend the funeral. But gosh, the hotel rooms were $600 a night in Boston. So they decided that they'd been teammates for 6 decades, they'd just be roommates for one more night. And they split the cost. Dick, would you come up? Dick, before I give it to you, I want to tell my favorite Joe Roberts story. You can have the rest, and you can correct us on the stories about the coaches. But Joe Roberts moved to Columbus in his junior high years. I think it was 7th grade. It might have been 8th grade. But he told his friends, new friends at the junior high where he went, that he was from L.A. He didn't tell them. He told him he was from L.A. He didn't tell him that L.A. stood for Lower Alabama. He also never had played basketball when he got to Champion Junior High. Now, in just a couple of years, he was starting at East, and East had 2 great teams while he was there, and he, of course, went to Ohio State. What happened is the coach that he ran into at his junior high was the highest regarded coach in the East High system. His name was Cy Butler. Cy went up to Joe and said, "Hey, big fella," he says, "you coming out for the basketball team?" And Joe said, "I've never played before." Cy says, "Well, we'll see about that." So between Joe's natural ability and his drive and Cy's coaching ability and his interest in Joe, Joe did what he did, and that's going to set the stage for Dick. But we really have a wonderful guest today. Cy, I believe, is here in spirit, as I believe all of the Fred's formers are who've passed on, and Fred, and I think they're all here. But Cy's here with us in spirit, but his son, Bill Butler, is in the back. And if you'd please stand up, Bill. So Cy Butler gave us Joe Roberts. And Dick, if you would talk a little bit about your co-captain and about your opinions on the coaches.
Okay, wait a minute. I have to find a note. Is that working or not? Yes. Okay. Cy, I have to tell you a story to start out with. Joe and I beat the living daylights out of each other for 3 years while we were in high school. I played football for West High, ran track, and played basketball, and never played on a team that beat East High, period. So no matter how hard we tried, I beat a couple people in track and field, but never won a game, period. And Joe and I always kidded each other about how we beat on each other for those years. In fact, this is a story about somebody else, but Dave Barker, who's going to be up here in a minute, Dave and I never met while we were in high school. I have to tell you that all but one player of our 1960 basketball team was from the state of Ohio. One was from Pennsylvania, and the rest of us were from Ohio. But I had never met Dave Barker because of the schools we went to. His school on the far east side was a step below an A class. We had A and B classes then, and West High never played their school. And Dave and I had never met until we were freshmen in basketball at Ohio State. And the first thing that happened in our first game when we were on the road, we were roommates. And we've called each other roomies ever since then when we walked up to each other. So that gives you an instance of that. But Joe was a good friend of mine. Joe, as you may know, lived in Oakland for quite a while at the end. My youngest son lived in San Francisco for maybe 10 years. And I would always find a reason, my wife and I, to go see Joe and Celia, have dinner or something, whenever we were in California. So Joe and I went to Joe's 80th birthday party in California, found out that he was 2 years older than me because I was only 78 at that time. But that was a little difference between his going to school in Alabama and me going to school here at the time, because I was 17 and a half years old when I graduated from high school. And he was 19 and a half when he graduated from East High. But we've still been friends all that time. And to add a little bit to Lee's story about the rooming, I sent an email out to the people saying that I would suggest that if you're going to go by yourself, not take a spouse with you or something, you go by yourself, you get with somebody else as a roommate, and anybody is willing to call me and be my roommate up there. And about 20 minutes after I sent that email, I get a phone call from Joe. Hi, roomie. I'll see you in Boston. So Joe and I have always had a good relationship, as have Dave and I. A little bit about Fred. Is that okay at this point?
Please.
Even though you may not know, we used to have mid-year graduations in Columbus when I was growing up. And I finished my last whole basketball season in March, and the next September turned 17, and then graduated the next January. So I had never met Fred before that. Because I was a track person. Also, I was the state champ in the high jump as a senior. My coach from West High wanted me to go to Miami. I had picked Miami, Ohio State, Michigan, Northwestern, and Illinois. Now, you may wonder why those schools. Those were the top 5 colleges in educating people in accounting, and I wanted to be a CPA. And so I was thinking about that. Nobody had talked to me about anything at Ohio State. My track coach said, Larry Snyder, who became my track coach at Ohio State, is going to be very interested in you because there's going to be a limit to how much you're going to be able to jump. You're going to gain weight because at that time I was about 1/8 of an inch short of 6'6", and weighed 172 pounds. Now, one thing you do not do at Ohio State is play Big Ten basketball at 6'6", 172 pounds. And it turned out I became the person who, when Fred needed somebody to slow them down doing things on a basketball court, I was the one that got asked to do that for a long time. And we won't bring up any names who did that, but it happened. I had my application ready to go to Miami one day in the fall of '55 when I got a phone call from Fred saying that we'd like to talk to you about coming to Ohio State to play basketball. So right then and there, the envelope that was filled out ready to go to Miami got thrown away, and I came to Ohio State. We have had 4 generations of men at Ohio State. My son's over here. He was a 3rd generation. His son was a 4th generation. My dad played baseball at Ohio State. My brother played baseball and basketball at Ohio State. So we've had a lot of us have things to do here. One of the things I want to tell you about Fred, when we were seniors, we had some traveling to do. We played 2 games in Utah, Brigham Young and Utah University. And we had school, or we did not have school going on when we were going to be gone and when we had to be here practicing for other people. So Fred asked each of us, there were 6 of us on the traveling squad who lived in Columbus. Fred asked each of us if we would take one person home for us during this practicing so that the other 6 people would not have to stay in the dorms during that time. I happened to draw a pretty interesting fella as my one, being Bob Knight. Yeah. And I've done a lot of things with Bob since then. In fact, my other son went to Indiana, and Bob became his godfather there. Our son, we had a 3rd car because I had an extra car I bought from the company at one time because it was a nice car and was cheap. And I told my son if he wanted to and would get Coach Knight's word for it, he could take the car back to Indiana at Thanksgiving. That was when he was a freshman. He could not have a car on campus. Freshmen were not allowed to have cars. And he said, well, why don't you call Coach Knight and get his price? I said, no. You've got a choice. You take a bus, you get a ride with one of your buddies, or you talk to Coach Knight. He said, well, I'd rather have you do it, Dad. And I said, I understand that, but we're not going to do that. So about a week later, it was on Wednesday night. I have no idea what week it was. I gave him a lot of time on that because I knew it was going to take it. And we had learned that the trip from Cleveland to Bloomington, Indiana is not a fun drive, particularly when you're taking kids back and forth. I got a good deal out of that because my wife, his mother, grew up in Cincinnati, and she liked to go get him then because she would then go to Cincinnati and see her mother and then go to Indiana, pick up the son and drive him home. So I got out of all that at that time. Yeah, but it was, but anyway, he said, Coach Knight said it would okay. I said, good. Oh, the other deal I made with him, I said, you will park the car at Coach Knight's house. You can't have a car on the campus, so and he told Coach Knight that, so he got there, he gets to Bob's house that Sunday afternoon, goes up to the door and said, Coach, can I use your phone to call one of my friends in the dorm to come and get me. And Coach said no. And he said, well, why not? He said, I'll take you back to the dorm. Don't worry about it. So that happened, and he looked after, he had arranged all sorts of, both of my boys studied finance, and the coach set up classes for, not classes, but interviews for him with the head of the finance class in Indiana. And both boys ended up completing those. So that was a good, interesting thing. So, you want to move on some, or you want to keep going?
Well, we better keep going because we probably have 3 or 4 hours worth of stuff to get through. Right. Dave Barker, as Dick mentioned, Dave Barker was an All-Ohio player at Columbus St. Mary's, and he's got some interesting stories about that, and also another interesting story about Coach Knight. But as a student athlete at St. Mary's, he was the right fit for Ohio State, except he was the wrong size. He was a 6'2" center, and at 6'2", he had to convert to guard. Well, his first year he was eligible to play on the varsity, he was behind a current captain and a future captain at guard. Okay, his second year, he was behind a current captain and a future captain at guard. His third year, he was behind Larry Siegfried and Mel Nowell, who started every game their Ohio State career at guard. So David didn't get the amount of playing time that he deserved, but still, he has a very, very significant place in Ohio State history. David, Joe, and Coach Taylor integrated Ohio State. The years that Fred played at Ohio State from 48, 49, and 50, there was a gentleman's agreement. You don't recruit blacks, and I won't recruit blacks, and blacks weren't recruited. That's the way it worked. Fred helped Ohio State put a stop to that, but the players that he brought in, really good people, really good students, really good players, just didn't work out. Two came in his first year, one basically a local basketball legend came in later on. They left either because of academics or because they were uncomfortable or whatever. David and Joe both came in. They both graduated in 4 years, just like everybody else on the 60-year team, I should say. And they're the ones who showed that Ohio State was a welcoming place to black athletes just as much as white athletes. So David, if you'll come up here, I know you've got at least 2 good stories and maybe more than that. Yeah. There you go.
Roomy. Set up.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
You got to put it closer, I think.
Oh, okay. Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
Even closer. Put it right up.
Okay. Again, it's a pleasure being here with Rumi. That for all of those years now, in high school, even though we were at the same level of school, Catholic schools, the only Catholic schools that played the public schools was Aquinas and St. Charles. And I went to St. Mary's in German Village, which was at that time, yes, it was German village, but a different German village than it is now. Anyway, Dick and I, as he said earlier, started there together and became each other's roommates right off the bat on traveling, which is pretty significant because you start to rely on, if you don't have this, he has that, or vice versa. So this created a unison of friendship. And we speak together often now, all of these years. And when I say often, monthly. And speaking of monthly, when you were talking about Jerry Lucas, he sends out a notice weekly to a bunch of us. And he always has a quote, but he texts us weekly, and I mean, how many years now? But he's been doing this forever and ever and ever, and that's the kind of friendship we developed through the type of guys that were recruited. As Dick said earlier, Fred recruited. I mean, the first thing he wanted you to know, if you weren't coming there to get an education, that was not the right school for you. When I was at St. Mary's High School, I thought I was good enough to go to Notre Dame. So I contacted a coach over there, and in fact, they had all of their scholarships filled up at the time. And I talked to the coach, and he invited me over. So I took a Greyhound bus on my money, which, who had money? Very little. And I took a Greyhound bus and went to the University of Notre Dame and met with the coach at the time. And as it turned out, no, that did not work out for me. I had a full ride coming up at John Carroll outside of Cleveland, and had sent in all of my papers. And talking with a friend of mine, Dr. Jimmy Hall, of which some of you probably knew over the years. And his advice was, David, you can either go to a big school and be a little guy, or you can go to a little school and be a big guy. So as it turned out, I figured, well, I'll go to a big school and be a little guy. And it turned out more than just being a little guy. It's turned out to be a great, great opportunity and experience for me. And also mentioned was, briefly, that every guy on our 60 team graduated with at least one degree. Now, times are different now. There's a thing called money that changes a whole lot of things. And so guys only go for a year or two or what have you. But back then, education was primary. And that's how it was. There were times when, and Dick talked about that we traveled and had situations where down in Kentucky it was a little different there with minorities, I mean, African Americans, blacks, whatever you want to call it at the time, and we were registered at a hotel, and we all were getting off the bus and went in the hotel, and they said, wait a minute, some of you are not going to be able to stay here. Fred Taylor walked up and said, yes, we're all going to stay here. And they said, no, that's not our policy. He said, well, then none of us are going to stay here. And we moved to another hotel. But those were the times. But friendships develop in many, many ways over many, many courses of time. I want to say that Mel Nowell, as has been mentioned, he and I, we talk probably 4 to 5 times a week, every week. He lives outside of Washington, D.C., and he sends his care and loving to all of you, and as has Celia Roberts, Joe Roberts' widow. She sends her love and care and prayers to all of us. And I speak, my wife Debbie and I, we speak with Celia a couple times a week, and we have for all of these years, and we'll continue. Of course, Joe passed away 4 years ago, and but his family and I and Debbie, we stay close and have for many years. I got a story. One other thing about Joe. Yes, Joe was from L.A., but he was really keen on education. And yes, after we graduated from Ohio State, over the years, Joe studied and received 3 master's degrees. Again, education first. And when you or when you team up with people with that kind of a, not necessarily drive, but that kind of a inner caring, not just for self, because we all know the more we get to learn about ourselves, hopefully the more we can share and love and push it on. Anyway, that's Joe Roberts. 3 additional master's degree outside of his bachelor's at Ohio State. And again, I said, Mel Nowell sends his caring and sharing and love because he's unable to be here today.
David, I don't want you to forget to tell them the story about the wedding that you attended and the phone call you made to Bob Knight.
All right. There was a reception down at Lindy's restaurant he's referring to. And this was, 4 or 5 years ago. And a bunch of people standing around, and a couple of guys were talking over there and said, that guy over there, he played for Ohio State on the 1960 championship team. And the guy said, what's his name? And whoever he's talking to said, his name is Dave Barker. And the guy said, David Barker, he played on the 60 team? I ain't never heard of him. Are you sure? And the guy said, yeah, come on, I'll introduce you to him. So the 2 guys walk over, and he said, Dave, this is, I don't know what his name was now, John somebody or another. And he said, I was telling this guy that you played on the 60 team with Havlicek and Lucas and Siegfried and Furry and that whole group of guys. And so the gentleman said to me, what's your name? I said, David Barker. He said, well, I never heard of you. And he said, do you know Bob Knight? I said, yeah. I said, I was on the team with him. he said, well, how well do you know him? I said, he's a close friend. And he said, if you called him, would he take your call? And I said, yeah. He said, oh, no, he won't. No, he won't. So I reached in my pocket and got my cell phone out, and I called Bobby. And I called, and his wife, Karen, answered the phone, and she said, hey, Bark, how you doing? I said, I'm all right. She said, what's going on? I said, well, I'm at this big-time party down here, and there's some guy challenging my word that I know Bobby Knight. And I said, is he there? She said, yeah. She says, I'll put him on the phone. So Bobby gets the phone, and he says, hey, Bark, what's happening? And, I tell him, I got this guy here, and he's questioning of our friendship. And he said, will you tell him? I said, wait a minute. Here, I'm going to let you tell him. I hand the phone. I was getting ready to hand the phone to Bobby, and he said, put it on speaker so this guy can hear me. And so I did, and I said, hey, Bob, here's the guy. And so the guy that took the phone, and he says, is this Bob Knight? Bob said, UMF? What the hell? Who the hell do you think you are? And he just raked this guy up one side and down the other. And I mean, and the guy standing there, and I don't know how many shades of red he turned. But the speaker was on the phone, and the people were standing around, and the guy he was just embarrassed as can be, and and Bobby just laid into him. I mean, with some words that I can't repeat. Okay, but that's Bobby. So Bobby ended up saying to the guy, all right, give the phone back to Bark. Give the phone back to Bark. And so, and he did. And Bob said, hey, Dave, turn off the speaker thing. Turn off the speaker thing. I said, okay, Bob, it's off, which I did. And he said, is it off? I said, yeah, it's off. He said, how did I do? But
David, don't say another word now. You just got an ovation. You just stole the show. If there's anything else you want to contribute later, that's great.
okay.
You got to drop the mic and walk away.
All right. Okay.
Okay, Jerry's not here, and again, that's microphone. And again, it's too bad Jerry's not here, but I think we've got it covered. I was asked to do a presentation of Jerry's basketball career at a fundraiser for him for his memory systems. And the guy that asked me, Gary Schottenstein, I said, Gary, I think I can do it in about 2 hours. He said, well, you've got 15 minutes. So that's the magnitude that we're dealing with. Well, I wrote it, and then I cut it, and then I cut it some more, and I timed it, and it was down to 22 minutes, and I didn't tell him. I just gave it the 22 minutes, and everybody loved it except for poor Jerry. You know how you're supposed to make eye contact with people when you do public speaking? Nikki, you're an expert in public speaking, is that right? Okay. She's a little on the shy side until you get to know her. But anyway, I've got that 22-minute long presentation on Jerry that's available to you if you just sign up for it. I'll be glad to send you the file, and you can read all the details. But just to hit some of the highlights, 3-time All-American, 3-time Big Ten Player of the Year, twice National Player of the Year, national champion in 1960, runner-up in 61 and 62, 3-year record of 78-6, Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame, first player to win a championship on every level, high school, college, Olympic, and NBA. There have only been 3 who've done it, but he was the first. To him, Fred Taylor gave the same sales pitch that you all know by now. Good education, compete for the Big Ten. That was his sales pitch. Everybody got the same thing. Other schools wanted to give his dad a job. They wanted to give him money. They had all sorts of offers, but Ohio State had everything he wanted. Education first, basketball second. In fact, Jerry Lucas did not come to Ohio State on a basketball scholarship. He came on an academic scholarship. He had the right to drop basketball anytime he wanted to. Well, you notice that he never dropped basketball, and we're all glad of that. But that's where education stood with him. Here, it's ironic that the most heavily recruited basketball player of all time was really a walk-on. Of all his achievements, this is my favorite, and I've never seen it in print. Ohio State played in 2 in-season tournaments while he was there. They played in 3 regional tournaments in the NCAA and 3 Final Fours. So that's 8 tournaments against the best players in America. One of the in-season tournaments was in LA, the other one was in New York. All across the country, Lucas played against basically everybody during his 3 years. And out of those 8 tournaments, he was most valuable player 7 times. And this is while he's playing with 2 All-Americans, Siegfried and Havlicek. That's the kind of player he was. Oh, the time he didn't win the most valuable player, he could hardly walk. The last game of his career, he'd been hurt the game before. So that's Jerry Lucas. And he's also something else that nobody ever mentions. He was top 50 in the NBA players, and then for the first 50 years of the NBA. Then he was top 75 for 75 years of the NBA. And he was the only one who played in the NBA out of position. Everybody else played their college position except for Jerry Lucas, who was a center in college, had to convert to forward. So that's the Jerry Lucas that a lot of us know, and that's the one you can read about and get all the details. And you know, everything that I left out, if I had done one thing of the dozens that I left out, I'd be really proud. So the way he was as a player, it just really defies description. You sort of had to see it over and over. Gary Gearhart couldn't be with us today, and I'm not sure why, and I'm a little worried about it, but he needs to be recognized because he was another All-Ohio kid. He led Dixie High School to the Class A semifinals. He played on an all-star team with Lucas, Havlicek, and Nowell, and they told Fred, this guy can play. You ought to talk to him. Fred did, and Gary joined the team. Gary said, my first day of practice my sophomore year, Fred said I had a chance to compete with Larry and Mel to start. The next day, an appendectomy was scheduled, which cost me about 6 weeks. That put him way behind, but by the end of the season, he was the first guard off the bench. Through most of his junior year, Gary was the first guard off the bench, but Siegfried and Nowell were outstanding. There was just no room. They both started every game. When Siegfried graduated, this was Gary's opportunity. He started, he played well. His statistics didn't show up in the box score because assists and defense were not chronicled in any way. And so everybody said, how many points did he score? Oh, he must not be very good. That's the way it was, the thinking was, not with Fred. He liked Gary's quickness, speed, unselfishness, and defensive skill. He was hurt again with pulled muscles and a bad ankle as a senior. Maybe played half the games that he played, 19 out of 28, half of those he was at full strength. He had 3 years of injuries at Ohio State, but he enjoyed a lifetime of friendships with the kind of people that you're hearing about today. Now, I've got a personal story involving Gary and the type of person he was and is. I went to Siegfried's funeral with Mel Nowell. We pull in the parking lot, and there's Jerry Lucas right next to us. So Mel and Jerry start talking, and what am I going to do? I stood there and listened to him. The same sort of thing kept going on for a few minutes, and soon we were in a group of people in the center, and all of the Siegfried's friends were surrounding us, looking at the people that they had admired on television oh so many years ago, and me. So I noticed this, and I turned to Gary by now and said, Gary, all these guys are looking at you, and they're wondering who in the world I am. What does Gary say? Happens to be all the time. So that's the Gary that we missed, because I was anxious to tell him that one more time. Joe Roberts. I've got to tell you some things about Joe Roberts. And what are they? They picked me pretty clean on Joe Roberts here. But I'll tell you my experience with Joe. Joe was the only one of all of these guys that I talked to, and I talked to about 50 people to interview them, only one of them who called me back. Joe called me back because he wanted to be friends, and he called me 2 or 3 times. And finally occurred to me, hey, this guy is calling me, and it would be rude not to call him back, not to mention stupid. So I did call him back, and I offered to get in touch with the local guys when he came to town. See, he owned some apartments in the town in Columbus. And so he'd say, I'm going to be in town. What about lunch? Where do you want to go? I'll get in touch with Mel and Dave. And usually some other people came down. So one of these days we had one of these gatherings, and Mel Knoll says, well, Jerry Lucas asked about the lunch. I said, how did he find out? I told him. Well, okay. And Mel said, I asked him. Now, Mel's an Ohio State graduate, so he automatically knew to ask Jerry to this lunch for Ohio State players. That's how sharp Mel was. But we had a great time. Gene joined us for a couple of them, too. I remember Gene was at Rubino's with us. And even Rex Kern, the football quarterback, stopped in for one. We got to go on to Larry Siegfried now. And Fred told me that Larry Siegfried was so good in high school that the coach built a team around him. Larry would jump center, get the tip. They'd give the ball to Larry to bring up court. He'd give it back to somebody else. He'd go into the low post. He'd get the ball back. He'd score. And this worked really well for Shelby, which had only lost 1 game that year. Larry led the state in scoring with 38 points a game. He even scored more than a guy named Lucas the year behind him. So with a 21-1 record, Shelby went to the state regional finals, where they lost to Toledo-Macomber. Larry told me Toledo-Macomber had 3,000 boys. We had 200. I was in Shelby High School later on for a book that I did on recruiting, and I was addressing them about the recruiting process. And there, in the middle of the cafeteria, was Larry Siegfried, a 6'3" life-size cutout. That's the kind of significance he had with Shelby. So he comes to Ohio State, and after being the best player and the high scorer on the freshman team and the best player and the high scorer on the varsity team as a sophomore, Lucas, Nowell, Havlicek, Gearhart, and Knight show up, and things are different. Siegfried had to adjust, and it was a huge adjustment. He goes from being top banana to having to become a very good defender and very unselfish, and still score some of the time and know which is which as the process continues. It was not easy for him to adjust, but he did adjust, or we wouldn't have a national championship to talk about. And the next year when he was captain, Ohio State was undefeated until the final game. He didn't adjust well to the professional ranks, even though he was the number 3 draft choice. But John Havlicek said to Red Auerbach, I played with a guy at Ohio State that could help us. And help us with the Celtics was, you've won 5 championships in a row, and he can help us. So that's the standard that John was thinking about. And Larry got a tryout. Larry made the Celtics. And 6 years later, they had 5 more championships because Larry knew how to fit in and do the things that were important to the team. By the last championship, 1969, Larry was the 3rd leading scorer on the team, but they were the right points at the right time, and the 2 leading scorers were guys named Bill Russell and John Havlicek, who you don't mind standing behind in line. When Larry died, his coach and teammate, Bill Russell was a coach for 3 years as a playing coach. Bill Russell traveled from Seattle to Shelby. I don't know how he did it, but he traveled from Seattle to Shelby to honor his friend, Larry Siegfried. Russell, as a playing coach, had no assistant coaches in the NBA at that time. But he had John Havlicek, who was the captain. He had Larry Siegfried, who was a resource, and they gave him a lot of support and helped him to win 2 championships in 3 years. Guys, would you tell us a Larry Siegfried story?
I get into trouble with some of this. One of the things, I'm going to add a couple of things before this. We had 17 people that we considered teammates of ours. Being the 12-person traveling team, we had 4 players who didn't travel ever with us, but were members of the team, and we had a student manager. There are only 7 of those 17 left at this point, if you wonder. And maybe 4 of them have something wrong with their body system at this point and are not doing very well. I have been to every funeral of every one of our players except one since it happened, and the team itself are very, very good at being together with each other. One of the things that I'd like you to know, and I'll tell you, we have a couple pictures back there against the wall. One at the top is our team picture of 1960 in the year we won the championship. And the bottom one was our team at our 50th reunion, sitting in the same position we were, 50 years ago. There's a little picture in the bottom of that has either 6 or 7 teammates that were members at my 80th birthday party 7 years ago this summer. And we've all done things like that. Gary Gearhart and I, and I'm sorry I didn't start this sooner, but when Bob got to Texas Tech, they asked him to start a golf travel trip for the key people at Texas Tech that would be interested in him. Gary started going right away, and maybe, I'm sorry, the ones I missed, because I missed England, Scotland, and Ireland. My first trip was to Portugal, second one to Utah, and one to Minneapolis. But we then went to and the first day we were there, we had some rules. If we wanted to have a drink for dinner, we had to pay for it ourselves. Bob paid for dinner and everything else, but not if we wanted to have a drink. And and it carried on like that. But I was teasing Bob a little bit. I told you the relationship Bob and I had with my one son and such at Indiana. Well, Bob and I got along well over almost everything, but the couple of the guys said, you ought to calm down a little bit in dealing with him. And I said, you got to remember that I was older than him and taught him a couple things, and he and I never had trouble over that. And they said, okay, but if you have trouble, we said it ahead of time. And we never had any of that trouble, and they always joked about that. But the situation with Larry, I only got to play with him 2 years because he was a year behind me in coming in. But he was a very, I don't think the word shy, but I'm trying to think, he was a pretty quiet person at doing things, but I got in trouble at his funeral because I made a comment to somebody else, and the gentleman from San Francisco, wonder who the heck are you talking about us? And one of the guys, I think it was John, turned to him and said, "That's okay." He was one of our teammates, and he said, "Okay." So, but I learned a lesson to make sure when I'm saying things like that. So, Larry was a heck of a good thing, but wouldn't tell us much of what to do. He just did it. So, you want to add anything?
I don't have anything on Larry.
Okay, we'll move along then.
Other than,
We have one rule. Whenever either one of them wants to talk, he's got the stage.
I just wanted to acknowledge his wife, Larry's wife and daughter that are here.
Tina and Olivia, would you stand up, please? Come on. Thank you, David. And
yeah,
why don't you introduce your wife, too?
and my wife Debbie. There's one other thing I want to say about the opportunity that comes with having something in mind. If you're trying to accomplish something and you work hard at it, it often creates additional opportunities. And one of the things that happened through this 1960 championship team and those 4 years at Ohio State is you get to know and meet a lot of interesting people in our travels. And one of the most interesting guys that we met when we were down in Kentucky, we were having dinner or something or another, and one of my friends that was from Louisville that I met as a freshman at Ohio State, his name is, anyway, he's from Louisville, and he had his friend there, and he said, "Hey Dave, I'd like for you to meet my friend." And I said, "Okay." So he waved him over, and he waved him over, and I stood up to shake the guy's hand, and my buddy said, "Dave, I'd like for you to meet Cassius Clay."
Ooh.
And I said, and he had just been on television the night before, or a couple nights before that. And I said, "Cassius Clay." I said, he said, "Yeah, that's me." And he went through his box. And I fell back. Okay. The moral of the story is, again, opportunities present situations that you don't forget. And I'm blessed to tell you that story along with things that Dick and I have been talking about all evening. So back to you, sir.
Well, thank you, except why in the world didn't you ever tell me that story before?
A couple more things that I've noticed. Frank Truitt, who we talked about. Frank Truitt was a junior high basketball coach at West High, where I went when I was a senior then. And then he moved to North and then to Ohio State. And the other thing I'd like to add, and then I'll be quiet for a while, is that when Floyd decided to retire, some of us who were active on the team by now wrote a letter to the athletic director suggesting him how strong we were feeling that Fred should get the job. And I don't know whether he paid enough attention to that or not, but it worked. So,
You did your best and it was good enough. That's what we know for sure. The next guy we've got on the list here is John Havlicek. And all I can say about John, almost, is get his book. It's Hondo, Celtic Man in Motion. The library has a couple of copies. They don't have very many copies, but people don't read it anymore. But it's just a fascinating story. Let me hit a couple of highlights. In his book, the man who wrote the foreword was Tom Satch Sanders, who was a teammate of John's for a long time, an opponent in the 1960 semifinal. Satch Sanders said John Havlicek called himself an Ohio State player. And I had an opportunity to talk to John, and I asked him, why? And John said, to me, that meant an acknowledgement to Fred Taylor, who helped us to grow as people, as teammates, and as a team. And I thought that was quite a compliment because he said it when he was an all-star. He said it when he was an all-pro. He said it all the time, and that was his frame of reference. As a freshman, John heard Coach Frank Truitt say, you guys averaged 170 points a game in high school. That's going to change. The challenge is defense. John listened more than anyone else. For him, defense was always first. My favorite story about John's defensive play comes from his sophomore year, which really isn't supposed to be the subject, but it's too good a story to leave out. As his role expanded, his passion for defense never declined. And this continued through 16 years in the NBA. The Bucks played against Southern Cal in the Los Angeles Classic in late December. Their star was a guy named John Rudimetkin, a 6'6" player who was an all-American preseason player along with Lucas. John wasn't supposed to be in that class. He was honorable mention preseason. So they're getting ready to play, and John can't wait to guard this guy. I mean, that's what he's living for. Fred assigned Lucas to the center and John to Ken Stanley, who was their number 2 scorer. As Fred said, John didn't like it at the time, but I thought we matched up better. Well, as usual, Fred was right. Lucas outplayed his man, scoring 38 points and allowing 18. John, well, he had 17 points and 10 rebounds. Poor Ken Stanley scored 1 point. Averaged 10, scored 1. We were at a gathering, I can't remember which one it was. I think it was Zanesville. And John said, my goal was to hold my opponent scoreless, and I never did that. And he was too modest to say that he got awfully, awfully close. As Frank Truitt put it, John did exactly as we asked, and he did it with enthusiasm. And that's a trait that he took with him undoubtedly for the rest of his life, and certainly to the 1974 playoffs. John won 2 championships after Bill Russell retired with Cowens and a guy named JoJo White. And in '74, they were playing against Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and the Milwaukee Bucks. And it was the 7th game. And John was having an outstanding series. He was going to be named most outstanding player of the '74 finals. And his coach, Tom Heinsohn, who had been a player when John broke into the league, his coach asked him to be a decoy in the championship game. Now, I don't know if it's good strategy to ask your best player to be a decoy, but Heinsohn did. And Havlicek went along with him. And when Heinsohn was talking about John after he died, that's one thing that he pointed out, was how modest John Havlicek was in spite of all the greatness that he achieved. Now, I got to tell you another Havlicek story, because the guy that caused it sitting in the front row, and he would be complaining for the rest of his life if I didn't. So I got a call from Dick Furry in 1995. We had known each other working together on the celebration, 35-year celebration for the Ohio State team. And Dick calls and says, you know, we're going to have the activity for the public on Friday night. This was like 10 days away. And I said, yeah, right. He says, and we're going to have a team dinner after that activity. Well, for the Friday night activity, it was sold out at the Hyatt Regency. That's how big the demand was. We had like 1,000 tickets sold, and people were asking to come 2 weeks before it, and they were sold out. So Dick says, the team dinner, we'd like to invite you to the team dinner. And I said, well, Dick, that's probably the greatest compliment I've ever had in my life, but I know when I talked to Fred initially about the book, they were having a Fred's Formers outing, and I asked if I could go to that, and Fred said, no, it's nothing personal, but we never have anyone there except the players and the managers and the coaches. Never, anyone. No friends, no wives, no kids, no exceptions. And so I'm thinking that those words were still in my head from 4 or 5 years ago when Fred had told me that. And Dick said, I just got off the phone with Fred, and he thought it was a good idea. So you can tell what it still means to me that happened. But I told you that story to warm up to this story. I told some of my friends basically to brag about what had happened, and they sort of brushed it off. I thought, one of my friends, this guy down here, Chip Heim, said, if you get a chance, ask John Havlicek how he would guard Michael Jordan. And I let loose. I said, Chip, I'm there on borrowed time. If they find out I'm not a member of the team, they'll probably throw me out. I don't want to risk that. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I was really curious what the answer was. So who do I sit down next to at the dinner? John. All right, so I'm eating dinner, trying to make conversation when I'm not thinking about what I'm talking about. I'm thinking about, am I going to ask him? And I developed a plan. I said, well, I'll eat dinner fast. I'll eat my dessert fast. That way, if I get thrown out, at least I'll be full. So I got through. I turned around, and I asked John, how would you have guarded Michael Jordan? 1 minute, John is sitting beside me. The next minute, he turns toward me, and he looked ferocious. I've never seen such intensity. There's no exaggeration here at all. This was otherworldly for me, the look that he gave me. Here's a 55-year-old businessman in a suit, in a basketball stance while seated. I mean, it sounds impossible, but that's what I saw. He says, first of all, Jordan was better on the drive than he was on the jump shot, so I'd play for the drive. If he drove past me and dunked on me, it's only 2 points. And Dr. J never dunked on me. And third of all, I would run him to death. Nobody has been in class and had a pop quiz with a more perfect answer than John had been thinking about for several years, I'm sure. Then he turned back and he was a human being again. It was remarkable. So, John Havlicek's the subject. What do you guys have to say about him? I'll start talking if you're not going to talk.
No, one of the things, if you heard, that I started the first game as a senior and had been cut over the eye, and my timing was off, and it was pretty bad. And John came in, and we started doing well, and that was my last game as a starter. But I also learned that I was probably better off playing sixth man at that time than John would have been, because he had not had the experience at that time as to what do you do in those different things, whereas I had had 2 years of previous experience. I used to tell people that I caddied for Frank Howard as a sophomore and such, which there was some truth to, so I learned a lot that John hadn't, but he was a heck of a person. I spent a couple times when I did a education program at the Harvard Business School going to watch him play rather than do something else there. A couple of my people that were there wanted to know why I was going to see a basketball game. I told them because one of my friends was there playing, and I wanted to go see it, and they said, okay. So, but he was a good person. One of the other things I think is interesting, and Tina could tell you this, when we've been having get-togethers of our championship team, we have invited all the wives, whether their husband were still living or not. So for this, we stayed strictly to Ohio people, I think, because of some of the distances involved. But it's an important thing, and this has always been a good thing. And the picture that I had back there taken, we asked the people who had come from out of town to come to breakfast the next day. And my brother and his wife were there. And she said, "Dick, I don't understand how your team gets along so well. Does every basketball team get along as well as yours did?" And I said, "I can't answer for a lot of other teams, but I know that this group of people get along better together than almost any group I've ever seen." And I think that, pretty much sums up, the dealings with people like John and Jerry and Mel. We played 1 year together because of the way the eligibility was and such. You couldn't play, and we all got along well doing it. So.
One thing I want to bring to mind about John is that in sports, there's a natural evolution that if you can play, let's say basketball, in middle school, you may not be able to play in high school. If you can play in high school, you may not be able to play in college. If you can play in college, you're probably not going to play in the NBA because there's so many people involved and so few positions. But so generally speaking, you're a star at one level and you're not so important at the next level. And the next level, you can't even play at all. John was better at every level. He was third team All-Ohio, or he was honorable mention All-Ohio as a junior if his name was correct when they listed Jim and the last name was misspelled. But I think that was John. But he was the third best player in the state as a senior. And he comes to Ohio State and he beats out a proven senior as a sophomore. And he got better with his years at Ohio State as his game expanded. He went to the Celtics after being a draft choice of the Cleveland Browns for football as a wide receiver, never having played the position before. He was a quarterback in high school. And he was the last cut of the Browns. They kept their first-round pick, an All-American wide receiver, Gary Collins, who was also a punter and saved him a position for that. And for 5 years, they called John and asked him to come try out. Now, by now, he was a 5-time NBA champion, and he was the leading scorer or the second leading scorer for Boston until he was 35. I mean, he was an established NBA player. They're asking him to try out for the football team. So he could just get better all the time. Now, we didn't talk too much about Mel. We need to talk more about Mel Nowell, who was a remarkable player at East. He set the scoring records for Columbus City Schools when he was a senior. His coach said he was so unselfish, he felt badly about scoring so much, thought the other players might not like him. I kept telling him I wanted to score more, not less. East had a record of 18-6, which is probably the best 18-6 that you ever heard of. Because in the state tournament that year, 1958, everybody was unbeaten, all 4 teams. East had played 3 games against 2 of those teams. They played Columbus North twice, they played Middletown once. Then they played another team, Cleveland East Tech, in the regional finals to go to St. John's. Mel had something like 31 points and 14 rebounds. The Dispatch described him as a one-man team. Then, like Siegfried, like Furry, he sacrificed when he was at Ohio State. His role was much more defined. He knew that was going to happen because he wanted to play with Jerry Lucas. But still, it was an adjustment. So, guys, you got some stories about Mel for us?
Mel and I, prior to going to Ohio State, there's a court called Poindexter Village, and it's an outdoor basketball court that on the east side. And that's where Joe Roberts, Mel, myself, guys from North would come down, and Linda McKinley, a couple of their players would come, and it was just outdoor, hard-nosed basketball. But it was just those times when you were learning how to be not a good player, but a great player. And you could see that in Mel. I mean, he was a darn good player. I mean, I don't even know how to describe it other than to say he was, if he wasn't named All-State every year, he should have been.
Well, he was the #2 player ranked in the state, ahead of John, but behind Jerry.
Yeah. And we played outside basketball all the time in the summer, and he was a star on the outside court as he was at Ohio State. And like I said, a close friend that I talk to now 3 to 4 times a week, and will continue. But great man, great family, close family with Debbie and I.
Dick, anything before we go on to Bobby?
No, I think it's fine.
Okay. We got to talk about Bob Knight because, I mean, there have been books written about him, but there are stories that you don't know about him. You could have read all the books, and we'll try to get to some of the stories. One of my favorites came from Dick Oddie when we had the 35-year reunion. Oddie was not there. He was the sports editor for the Dispatch. And Oddie said, I kind of took Bobby under my wing when he was at Ohio State. Oddie said that one time they were at Illinois, and I think this was Bob's sophomore year, which would have been the championship year, and they beat Illinois soundly, and Oddie went to bed after writing his story, and there's a knock at the door. He opens the door, and there's Bob. Bob says, I need to borrow some money. Oddie's half asleep. He says, why do you want to borrow money? He says, well, I want getting the hell out of here. He was upset because he hadn't played that night. I said, Oddie says, what are you going to do? He says, well, I'm going to fly home. Oddie looks at him, and he's waking up by now, and he says, Bob, we're in Champaign, Illinois. You're going to Orrville, Ohio. What airline do you think makes that flight? Joe Roberts talked about Bob guarding him in practice, and this is the day after a game, and Roberts has probably played 30, 35 minutes, and Bob may not have played. And Knight wants to play, and he's holding and grabbing and pushing and Roberts, and just Joe was upset. He says, Fred, get him off me. Fred replied, get him off yourself. I mean, to Fred, that's what practice was all about, learning how to handle your own problems. In fact, I don't know if this ties in with basketball or not, but when Fred would take his daughters out to dinner to celebrate their birthdays, one of their daughters told me that he was helping them figure out how to go on dates. So Fred's idea of practice just had no ends. Jerry Lucas said, after games, we all wanted to discuss everything that had happened. After practice, all we wanted to do was get to dinner on time. But Bobby wanted to talk about every little detail. Are they playing my song? Are we over?
Well, it is 4:47.
Okay, I'm sorry, folks. I knew this was going to happen. We didn't even talk about the season. We didn't talk about the players. We didn't finish night. I'm sorry. 4:47. We got to be out of here at 5 o'clock. A couple of quick questions. I know.
Yeah. Okay, and I'm going to bring the mic around so that it'll be on the recording too. So.
For most of us who were lucky enough, well, some of us were lucky enough to see a game in person at St. John Arena, and we idolized these guys. But most of the time, though, when we learned about them, it was through watching it on TV, and it was through the narrative and the play-by-play of Jimmy Crumb. So is there anything you can tell us about Jimmy Crumb? I seem to remember him saying something like, "Aunt Minnie, we've got a real barn burner here tonight." Didn't he say something like that? Anyway, can you tell us anything about Jimmy Crumb?
I talked to Jimmy when I was doing the book, and he told me a couple of stories. And the one I remember is he was famous for "How about that?" And he explained why he said "How about that?" He said he would go to practice, and Fred would describe a play. And it would be 2-on-2, and then it would be 3-on-3, and then it would be 4-on-4, and then it'd be 5-on-5. And Jimmy said he would sit there and watch that play evolve. And then he would sit in the broadcast area, and he would see it. And the words he wanted to say to express himself were not allowed on TV. So he decided, I'll just say, "How about that?" So that's where it came from. Another quick question before they throw us out. Okay, I've got one last story about Knight. Oh, I'm sorry, Bill.
Just a quick comment. I'm Bill Reed. I went to school with this guy up here at Lee. But anyhow, we were at a dinner one time. You've talked about he declined his athletic scholarship and said, "I earned an academic scholarship," and he was really proud of that. Jerry Lucas, I'm talking about. He was really proud of that. And another story, I'll try to make it quick. We're at Rubino's, one of the lunches with Lucas and a lot of the players there and so forth. We took a team picture, and we're all lined up there. I'm in the middle of the picture standing next to Lucas. And I'm a little bit shorter. I'm, I can't remember the terminology. Anyhow, there's a group of guys that were from Bexley also. We went to Bexley. Gene was our teacher. And they were sitting down the other end. They were just there, just happened to be there. There's about 6 or 8 guys here. And they said, I'm Bill Reed. He said, "Was Reed on that team?" And the Petersons were there too. And they were all going, yeah, he was on that team. and he said, "Well, what number was he?" And he said, "Well, Lucas was 11 and I was 5.5.
I'm going to end it then with the Bobby Knight story. He told us about himself. This is on YouTube. You can find it. There are 2 different versions, but that's the way that is. In '84, he was the coach of the Olympic team for the United States. They had to win the gold medal because it was the Cold War and we had to beat Russia. Well, we did beat Russia, and then we played Brazil in the finals. And halftime of the game, we're ahead by a large margin. The final score was 96-65. Ahead by a large margin, and Knight wanted the team to maintain focus and play another good 20 minutes. That was his goal. So he used an old coaching trick to pick on the best player. Now at halftime, Michael Jordan had something along the lines of 17 points, 9 rebounds, and 11 assists. That's a pretty good day's work, but that's at halftime. So Knight says to Jordan, "All you do is score, rebounds, and make assists. In the second half, I want to see you set some screens." You know how screens were important with Fred? Well, they were even more important with Bob. So it's Michael's turn. He says, "Coach, isn't it possible that I set them so quickly that you didn't see them?" And from the old school of the coach is always right, Knight said, "Well then, could you set them a little slower so I can enjoy them?" I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed you. Poor folks that had to leave, I feel sorry for them because they missed good stuff. Please sign up for more information. You can read it at your leisure, and you won't be rushed. One thing I've got to do, I'm sorry, I'm going to be fast. The 68 team is represented by Denny Metters. And Denny, stand up, Denny. He was the captain. He was the captain in '69, but he was a key player on the 68 team. And the reason the 68 team is important is they're in many ways the opposite of the 60 team. They were picked for 10th, not in the country, but 10th in the Big Ten in 1968. You would say they weren't very well appreciated. 2 of their players were mentioned in the preseason. One of them was hurt and lost for the season. Yet, like the 60 team, they had a great coach. They followed what the coach told them to do, and they excelled. They won the Big Ten in a playoff. They went on to the regional. They had to play Kentucky at Kentucky with Kentucky referees. And they beat Kentucky, number 3 ranked team in the country. Ohio State still wasn't ranked. Then they went on to Los Angeles and lost to North Carolina, which was a top 5 team. Then they beat Houston, which was there, and they beat Houston in the 3rd place game. And the thing that's important to me is Fred won with players who were supposed to be good, which is a huge challenge. A lot of coaches don't do that. And Fred won with players who weren't supposed to be good, but he had found something special in their character, and they excelled. One more person I've got to introduce is Doug McDonald and his wife, Sally. Doug was the, please stand. Doug was the captain of the 1963 team, and Doug stood up at the preseason dinner and said, this is after Lucas, Havlicek, and Nowell had graduated, and Ohio State wasn't supposed to be any good anymore. Doug stood up and said, I know we lost a lot of players. What were their names? And then he backed it up by winning the Big Ten again as captain. So, folks, again, thank you. This has been a real treat. And thank you, Bexley Public Library.
Your email address.
Oh, yeah, it's back there, but I forgot to give it to you, and I promised it. Do you have a piece of paper and a pencil now? LCARYER@gmail.com.